Hello everyone. Is anyone sick of bedding areas yet? I'm not, but eventually maybe I could get there. I'm not sure. Wanted to bring you probably one of the last videos on the bedding, even though I may continue to work on it for quite some time. I am back in the further part, I guess you could say, of my property where the majority of the woods lies, and kind of on an old logging road. I don't know if you can see that. There's a few small rubs around. There's one over there, and right here, and my focus today is more on a bedding pocket. I know we've talked about what I've been doing in the switchgrass fields. We've been talking and kind of going over the plantings that I've done in the last couple of years, but so far I don't think this year we've touched too much on making what many of us talk about on our habitat visits, and that's more of a pocket in the woods. It's definitely not the only thing to utilize in a theory, but once you've kind of done, if needed, a kind of a select cut and got things thinned out a little bit, you can go a little bit further by creating defined bedding areas that we want deer to be comfortable in. We want them to travel from these bedding areas out to our stand locations, and really just ultimately prevent them from catching on to how we're hunting them. And so right here you can see quite a bit of open sky. It's not a huge area, but I'd like to get it close to, a quarter, maybe a sixth of an acre, something like that. Something, big enough to, I know I was mentioning in my last video, to get enough sunlight to actually make a good difference, and not just, releasing one tree and doing a little bit of cutting where maybe that tree benefits, but it's not going to release enough and get enough sunlight to the ground to create a natural, nice, smaller bedding area. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger size-wise. And you can also see, I did get those two poplars hung up on each other, but I'm going to try and fix that. But numerous poplars around, birch, some beech, and then there's a northern red oak, a couple white oaks over there. I will leave those standing, but the rest of them, very little wildlife value. And the aspen has that 1,000 shoots per acre. So we're getting the sunlight to the ground. It'll be enough sunlight for those shoots coming up to regenerate well, and probably, even suffocate some of the other species to get a nice thick area going. And so we won't hinge those. We're going to flush cut them, get them down to the ground. But this is an internal piece of the property. You can see, I think we have another rub right there, and you can see over there, there's a little bit bigger one. But essentially the bedding area, it's not only, towards the middle of the property, it's also in an area where the deer are likely to travel, right? They're likely to utilize this. I found a couple areas where I believe the deer have bedded. They might be a little bit older, but they're little high spots in here where the deer can kind of sit up, look for predators, but also utilize all this side cover. So open areas, sunlight, inward part of the property area that I'm not necessarily going to be hunting, maybe on the very outside as far as a morning stand goes, right, in relation to bedding. But one other thing I wanted to mention to you guys, as far as, since we were on the topics of planting over this last week or two in some of my videos, is what you can also be planting back here. Many properties we go to, these general areas, even if they're not a swamp, just because of the shade and different things, they often tend to hold more moisture. So in an area where you're gonna have a little more moisture, you're trying to thicken it up, but it's also bedding. We want woody browse for the deer. We want them comfortable. We want them here. We want them staying in daylight, right? Everyone says, Joe, I want to hold bigger bucks on my property. Don't want the neighbors shooting them. Well, they have to have that food source in that bedding area, or they're not going to want to stick around very long at all, and they'll probably just end up passing through. So red osier dogwood is a perfect example of being able to utilize a little bit more of the wet ground, give the deer a food that they love, keep them comfortable, keep them sitting in bedding areas, and then eventually, of course, moving on to that third feeding, either going by your stand in the morning stand, or coming out to your third feeding. But most importantly, not catching on to what we're doing, remaining calm, and in that shorter daylight movement, keeping them on our property for that. So outside of red osier dogwood, guys, we could be using different pine plantings, right? You could be sticking them in kind of areas where the deer hopefully may not browse a little more. They're still going to get the sunlight, or at least a decent amount. but the deer aren't just going to come through and bite them right off the top, right? If this is a lane and I stagger a bunch of plantings right there on the lane, there's a good chance the deer are going to mess with them, right? They're already rubbing on these trees. So there's a good chance that if I put some trees they're going to want to rub, cedars or whatever, they're going to mess with them. So try and, pick out some spots where maybe it's a little harder for them to get to, into maybe some down trees that you have. Things like your white pine, instead of the Norway spruce and things like that I was showing you, they're going to do a little bit better with a little bit more shade tolerance. So, if you have some canopy, or we're using pockets, so the sun of course is moving, and so it's going to get some sun, some shade. We're hoping for regrowth. It's a great spot, just like this, where I can see that I do not have basically any pines growing naturally. And I could even throw a little fence around them for a year or two if I wanted to get particular about it, and I could get some additional thermal wind cover going for those deer and just make the bedding area even more attractive. So it takes planting, it makes it these pockets. We're looking at the types of trees or clusters of, poplar and aspen and things like that to utilize, right? And we're also, they don't have much lumber value, so it works out very nicely for both sides of the fence, I guess you could say. But I guess that's really all I wanted to point out in these pockets. I might space out, I like to do 50 yards right in that area. It can be a little more, a little less. But what's also nice about that, guys, is when I space them out a little bit, the deer can, start to go through the areas that aren't super thick, and they have, more of those escape routes that we talk about and things of that nature. It makes a little bit less work for you. I don't know if you can see, I have a bunch of other cuttings and stuff like that, just because I know I've talked about before the basal area being fairly high. You see all these, there's just so much stem count in here, variety of trees, that this is winter. When this is, fall or summer, spring, the canopy is just crazy. It's just shaded out. So doing a little bit more of the select cut, you can see a lot of those other trees are just laying on the ground. But identifying the particular ones for the bedding areas is really going to help with that regeneration. I'm sorry, but what I was talking about before is, then you have to go back into those areas you cut and clean up, make escape routes, right? If this log's in their path, it might make sense to chop it a section so that the deer can easily get through. They don't feel trapped, when we're directing them where we want to direct them. And if you're just doing kind of random cuttings, you're gonna really have to figure all that out, and it just seems a little more sporadic. Where if I do a pocket, you can very much see this as a good example. I was able to use the lean or fell the majority of the trees towards one area. I could clean up a couple things, but they can pretty much bed on the outskirts of this, pocket. We get the sunlight. I might drop another poplar or two over there just to make sure that, this area is actually getting the sun, since that way is south. And I won't have to do quite as much cleanup work. So it's very important that you guys do that. And so if we space our pockets out with decent distance, even as the trees fall, a little bit more naturally, you'll have space in between each pocket, and the deer can kind of funnel through, and a little less work for you, because day in and day out, you're doing this, quite a few times over the winter. Eventually it'll start to potentially be a little bit more a work and a little less play, but right now enjoying it very much so. So I hope you guys are getting out there. Again, these pockets are just an added tool to the things that I've mentioned previously. Probably be back here another 3 times or so, coming back to some areas where I want to just enlarge in a little bit, focus on specific pockets and a little bit less of a select cut, and then we'll have a good bit more bedding in some thicker areas for when fall is here. It'll be here before we know it. So I'll see you guys next time. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good week.